Amen. Amen. You know, my wife and I, in April, it's been 21 years that God has allowed us to be in ministry this April. Yeah, it's one of those things where I remember when I was first starting, I had some older pastors say the tenaciousness that you would need to have the heart of a lion and the skin of a rhinoceros to endure, to see through God's faithfulness. And in each hardship that we faced along the path, people would say, God's preparing you for something in the future, which at the time I took as an encouragement to mean that it's hard now, but it gets easier later. Yeah, I didn't catch the joke at first. See, that it actually gets harder in that. And even in the situation that we find ourselves in today as a church family, I'm reminded of a place my wife and I were at a few years ago when God had called us to Chad. Our place on the team was always to be the first into a country, to set up the communications, to set up the foundation for our legality to be in the country. And so we would go in and we had our convictions as a team, that we were meeting together as a team, that we said, this is how we want to go about being established in this country. And we laid out this plan. We had backup plans. We had it all worked out. And then we landed in country, and one by one, all of our plans fell apart. And when you enter a country, you need a visa. You start with a tourist visa, which in our case was 3 months, and we were trying to go for a long-term visa to be in the country, which would have been a year. And little by little, that deadline began to creep closer. And all of our plans fell apart. All of our options, everything that was known was gone. And we're in country, and now I'm thinking I have to get 5 kids and a wife out of the country that we've tried to be established in the last 3 months. And we're days away from having to immediately leave and start this whole process over with the team waiting for us to figure it all out in France. By God's providence, a guy that we knew in West Virginia knew a guy in Zimbabwe who knew a guy in Chad who helped us extend our visa with 3 days left before it expired. Then we took the next month. We were able to secure visas for the team. Over that next month, I called the team in France, and I'm like, everything's worked out, you can come. It was the next day that we got word that rebels were about to attack. And I had to call them and say, never mind, don't come. We were shortly later evacuated by French military, and then we were back in country. I say all of that because of this, and this is what I'm reminded of in the situation we find ourselves in tonight. We had our convictions. We had our plans. They all fell apart. And yet God was faithful in the end, that he's established something in Chad that has far outweighed anything that Kirsten and I could have done. It has far exceeded any plans that we had or intentionalities that we had when we first entered that country. And now there's 4 or 5 teams, dozens of families, like double that of children working among 4 or 5 different people groups that have no access to the gospel now because of what God established, because of the plans that he had. And so that as we hear about where we're at tonight as a family and as a church family, I think we do learn from God's faithfulness, of the experiences that I think in the stories we can all share, that we make our plans, but the Lord establishes our steps. And so tonight what I want to do is really build upon where we left off at our last meeting. That was when we had the meeting after the service, and we were really talking about kind of what our plans were. This is what I had put up. This was the 3-phase plan, that we wanted to have this foundation beneath our feet of the spiritual health of the church. Like, we can't just assume this. This has to begin with us. That the clarity of the vision as we move forward, and then the ministry development around that vision. And then we had kind of laid out, okay, in this first phase of the plan, we need to figure out the ministry direction. We need to figure out a new location, since we need to be out of this facility by the end of May. We wanted to understand team development and developing teams to work together to achieve this vision. And we needed to come to a place of greater financial fortitude because in February, we started the month with $3,000 in savings. That was our starting point. This is where we laid out. And so the question is, where are we now? What does that look like? And that's kind of what I want to be able to talk about this evening, is to start with the vision, then to look at the location and the impact that has, and then finances, to update you on where we're at in God's faithfulness in that. I do want to let you know that by God's grace, we have been able to bring in outside counsel through this season with a gentleman named Steve Smith. He is with an organization called Church Equippers. He has worked with churches in a numerous situations. So we've had this outside counsel because the elders have been meeting on a weekly basis. Every Tuesday morning, we're meeting in my office to be praying for the church, to be discussing, to looking at the options, to be understanding these areas of spiritual health as far as location and finances. And so this has been something that really we started looking at the spiritual health. Like what is the purpose of what God is doing here? That this is a spiritual body, right? This isn't just about meeting together and having a place on Sunday mornings that we gather. This is a spiritual body that God is forming. It's not just a club. It's not just an event that happens once a week. And so what does that look like? And making sure that our hearts are healthy and understanding the hurts and the pains that all of us have experienced in a different way. Coming to where we're at today and letting the gospel bring healing to those places as we look to the future. And making sure that we're moving forward from a position of health. And then we begin to ask questions around the vision. Like, why do we exist as a church now? What is God calling us to be and to do? What do we see as a need as we look out into the community and world? What are the needs beyond our walls, beyond the gathering here? And how has God equipped us to serve and help meet that need? This is part of the heart and the vision of the church. And so I kind of want to start with the vision piece. Because for me, I love, when Kirsten and I first started coming to CrossPointe 6 years ago, I've loved the theological foundation that was laid. Being rooted in the gospel and understanding that as we grow deeper in our understanding of all that God has done for us, we grow in the expression of that. That this is a solid foundation that we want to continue building on and continue solidifying. But as the elders have prayed and as we've talked about who do we want to be as a church now, there are some distinctives that we see. Like in the past, I would say that our ministry expression has been solely a Sunday morning gathering, has been our primary focus. And out of Sunday morning, then we've scattered into community groups that meet throughout the community. And this is where we were doing care. This is where we were doing discipleship. This is where we were doing foundations for new believers. This is where we were equipping new leaders. This is where all of that was happening. And then the vision for the city, to see the city informed and transformed, was by church planting, by seeing churches established within 15 minutes of anybody within the Orlando area. This was the ministry expression. And as we look to the future and who we are, there's a conviction that we want to be an everyday church, not just a Sunday morning gathering. But what does church look like Monday through Saturday as well? We gather on Sunday morning and we sing and we celebrate, but we say go and be the church. And so what does that mean? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and in the places that God is sending us, in the workplace, in our homes, in our neighborhoods. What does church look like there? How do we understand then community groups as a place of, yes, this is where we grow, but I think there's an opportunity to also understand how are we rooting new believers in the scripture? How are we growing and how are we doing discipleship? How are we growing? How are we equipping leaders? How are we equipping not just leaders, but how are we equipping the everyday saint to be faithful, to share? To communicate the gospel, to be rooted themselves, to use their gifts that God has uniquely given them for his glory. And I think that there's opportunity to explore and to understand these expressions alongside Sunday morning and community groups. To have a foundation that we're allowing people to be rooted in, that we're intentionally helping people grow in the gospel and then be on mission together as a church family. And that it's not just through church planting, though it is also that, but also what kind of impact would we have if each one of us felt equipped and called, and the people that you're going to come in contact with this week to share the gospel? That it's not just the responsibility of a few. It's not just the responsibility of an ordained pastor or an elder to proclaim the good news of the gospel. It's the responsibility of all of us as we go about our days, as we go about our lives, to faithfully proclaim the good news of Jesus. And so is that something we feel resourced to do? Is that something that we're challenging people to do? Because it's there that we'll begin to see transformation. That is, homes and families and neighbors and coworkers are transformed. And then God will raise up local community of believers, churches in those areas. This is what I long to see for us as a church. And yet I'm also aware that as we consider this, there's some different questions that we begin to ask. And I have some of these on the screen. Because location matters. As we think through understanding the vision, but we also have to understand the cultural context that we're in. So what is the culture like for where the church is located, and how can we both connect to it but also challenge it in our communication and in our ministries? Where are we located? Is it a city? Is it a suburb? Is it rural? Is it urban? And then how does that impact our ministry expression? How do the various ministries in the church, our word and deed and community and instruction, relate to one another? These are all the kind of questions that the location helps us impact. And to be honest, I was hoping that we would have more clarity as we come here this evening. Like, I was hoping that we would be able to have that fleshed out and say, this is where God has us. We're getting ready to sign a lease, and this is what ministry is going to look like. And those were all my plans. And they have not turned out. And so when we look at the location, from the very beginning, as we've met as elders, we've asked questions like, where do we see both need and opportunity in our community? How do we get ahead of the population growth and position ourselves not just to survive for another 6 months, but what does it look like beyond that? What does it look like in the next year, in the next 5 years, to have this extended impact in the community that we're going to be? And so we began, and the elders have been praying through this, and we've been searching, and we started in Lake Nona because this is where we gather. This is where we've been, right? And so we began searching here in Lake Nona, but if you're familiar with the area, there's some real challenges here. I mean, it's a new community. You're not finding a shopping center. We've looked, all the schools have churches in them. Like, this is a community saturated with churches. And there's a lot of great churches and still more rising up. That is a reality of this context. And we looked and we explored. We were hoping that Wycliffe was going to work out. That did not turn out to be an option. And so we continued looking. And then we're like, okay, God, let's continue to expand that search, asking those same questions. Where would you have us? There's our plans, and then there's also God's direction. And so we began looking down Boggy Creek. We looked at the charter school, and there's an elementary school down there, and we reached out to them, and we talked with them. And one by one, the hard thing for me has been this. I've prayed that God would make it clear. I wanted God to make it clear, but I didn't want the answer he gave me. Like, can I just be real with that? Like, I wanted it to be like, yes, make it clear, give us that one clear option, and I really want it to be here. And then when all of those came back, no, it's been hard. And that is where we're at. we don't have a place that is a viable option in this immediate vicinity. But more than that, the conversation and the questions that we began with are the same questions that we're asking now, and the same questions we want to invite you into as we continue to pray and discuss. Because as we look and as we say, where do we see both need and opportunity? Where do we see that growth is headed? And is God leading us, as it seems evident right now, unless something changes outside of Lake Nona, looking to do a replant outside of this immediate vicinity, is what it seems like God is leading. And so we began to ask, is that further north or is that further south? And so then the question became, is it further south? And that's what we're praying through. There's no decision, but I want to invite you into that process, not just that God would provide a location, but he would provide the location where he wants us to establish a gospel presence for the community that he's raising up. So I want to open up for a time of questions on that. I know it's a lot of information. I wish it was more, but that is where we're at this moment. So as it relates to vision or location, are there questions?
Available options south along Boggy Creek.
We looked along Boggy Creek. There's no known options on Boggy Creek at this point. If we keep going down Narcoossee, there isn't any available options until you hit 192. Yes?
I'm sorry, I just wanted to clarify. Did you say that you guys are feeling a strong leading definitely south of here, or that's just an option you're still looking at?
It's still an option that we're looking at. Okay. It's not a definitive. As we think and as we pray, that's something that we are seriously considering. Yeah, but it is kind of like, it's either going to be north or south.
Okay, not west at all?
West was kind of on Boggy Creek in that area, but we haven't been able to find anything there.
Because there's hardly any churches out by me and lots of houses.
Where's that?
Wyndham Lakes is literally, if you take Lake Nona Boulevard and it dead ends into Wyndham Lakes Boulevard, and then left and right, there is a massive amount of communities and nothing else. I'm not saying that you could put a church inside those communities, but I'm just saying there's a lot of people out there and hardly a church. There's only a couple of churches anywhere near. Just a thought to look that way too. I don't know.
I'm going to interject because I'm an elder now and I can't. No, I'm just kidding. As if like what was just experienced here, if there's a school or something that we're missing in that area, so we'll connect with. This is definitely why we're opening the conversation is
yes.
to connect to other areas. So,
are you able to share the results of your conversations with the charter school?
The main question, the issue was there were no classrooms. We could use a space, but it was the same thing at Wycliffe.
Again,
they were
so
not able
no
to make any space
for
available for children.
Okay.
Yeah, can we actually, rather than just moving on, I was going to have time at prayer at the end, but spend some time in prayer around our tables. That I really want this to be, like there's a weight I have in my own heart as we look at even at various locations and desires that I have or how I thought things were going to work out, and really having to say, okay, God, what do you have? Like all my plans, I've exhausted them. But he has a plan and he has a purpose. And I believe that without question and without doubt, that he is at work in this. And I see his fingerprints at work in so many different ways, in the ways that the teams have come together, in the way the church body has pulled together, and where we're at financially compared to where we started this journey at. Like, I've seen the church pull together, and I realize that as we expand the search, it will exclude families. And it breaks my heart, and yet I realize that God is ultimately the Savior. He is ultimately the head of the church, and it's not one congregation. It is his kingdom. and he is the Savior. And however he leads and whatever he chooses to do, this is what I'm having to preach to myself. This is a conversation that I'm needing to have. But I want to encourage us together to pray and ask, what does God have for us as a church family? Where does he desire to root us in the community so that we're not just meeting there, not just having a Sunday morning presence, but we are actively engaged on mission together in that community all week long? That's my heart. That's my prayer. And now the question is, God, where would you have us do that? So can we just take some time, pray for that around the table? As I think about next steps and, okay, where do we go from here? The elders are continuing to pray through this month. If God has given you an idea, if you have an idea, if he's laid something on your heart through this prayer time, please share that with the elders. You can email that to me at steve@xpoint.com. As a side note, if you did get any other email from me, please disregard it. Somebody did pretend to be me recently. Yeah. So if it says God bless you, I do God bless you, but that was not me. But please email us. Let us know. We want to continue tracking down. If you have connections, I'd ask that help us by going ahead and reaching out and making contact. So we've tried to track down all the leads we know. And so we would like to hear from you. And as you continue to pray, as you continue to process, we want this to be something that we are processing together. We want to invite you into that process of where we are. And we're not just trying to find a solution off by ourselves in that. So please share with us in that. So we're asking God to provide clarity by the end of April, because we need the month of May to make whatever transition that is. And so we want to have another family update immediately following the service on May 6th in 2 weeks, where we'll share where we're at. Again, that'll be a short meeting after the service, but so we can keep short accounts to know where we're at and what we're working toward throughout the month of May and what that transition looks like. So that's kind of the timeline that we're looking at as we move forward here. Are there any questions with that piece? So I do want to thank you for the way that the team development has been a big piece that we have looked at. If you go into my office, you'll see these large Post-it notes all over the wall. And as you guys have signed up to help with different teams and serving in different areas, I want to say thank you. This has been a tremendous blessing and joy, and something that we long to see when the church is working together as a church body. That it's not just a few, but all the unique gifts that God draws together is a beautiful picture of his body. And so I want to say thank you for that. One of those teams is our finance team that has been meeting diligently over these past weeks. And I know that we are delayed in getting official numbers to you and where are we at? It took time to kind of understand the numbers and to get the team up to speed. But I do want to invite Gary Chu up, who has, thank you, I was looking around where is he? Yes. So Gary's going to come up and share. He is the leader of our finance team. He has been a tremendous blessing in helping with this. So thank you so much.
All right. Good evening, everybody. Thank you, Steve. As Steve mentioned, my name's Gary Chu. I am part of the finance team, and he asked me to share a little bit about what the finance team's been working on. So I have a couple of slides. Okay. So we prepared this slide that talks a little bit about where the church's finances were in the past and then where we are moving in the future. So we'll start with the budget. So initially in the past, the budget was created basically by the paid staff, and they managed everything related to the finances, monitored the actuals, and did all that. So in the future, currently we've had about 5 or 6 people step in, be a part of this finance team that's going to add more eyes on the finances, which allows the pastors to do the things that they should be doing. And this finance team is going to help create the budgets, which we've been working on a new budget for the transition, and we'll share that with you. And then we'll also be presenting information. We'll be presenting the budget to the elders, which we've already done. They've seen it and essentially approved it. So that's what the future will look like. The finance team will kind of be the ones that are really looking at the numbers closely over the months and then sharing that insight with the elders and allow them to make the decisions that they need to make. The second thing, in the past, we would have an annual budget presentation during the vision night. We're going to change that so that we're going to have more of a quarterly financial update. Now, we don't know exactly what that's going to look like, whether that will be more of a verbal update from the pastor or whether that will be something that's sent out or emailed in the future. We're not exactly sure, but we do know that they've committed to giving more updates, and on a quarterly basis, they'll be doing that. So that's something that's going to happen in the future. The third piece, as Stephen mentioned, at one point in February, the cash balance of the church was down to $3,000. In the future, they want to have at least a 30-day cash reserve to cover expenses, and there's really some good news to share in this aspect. As of March, at the end of March, the church had in its bank account a little more than $67,000. So thank you to everyone for your generosity and really helping to create that cushion. So moving forward, we're in a much, much better place than we have been, and that's all thanks to the generosity of all of you. So, okay, so this is probably a very, very boring looking slide to most of you, but to me, this is what I do every day. So if you want, there are some sheets of this actual document at the tables here, so you feel free to grab one if you want one. It won't hurt my feelings if you don't. But basically what you see here is, on the left side of this document, is the 12 months of actual activity that have happened between April 2017 through March of 2018. It shows the giving, it shows the expenses, and basically the bottom line is that in that 12-month period, we had a deficit of $52,000. Now, that $52,000 deficit, a big reason for that deficit is the $50,000 gift that was given, and then during this period, it was then given to the organization that it was intended to be given to at that time. And so that shows up as a $50,000 expense in this period. And so that's the biggest reason that there's such a huge deficit in this 12-month period. As you can see, the building itself was almost 41% of the budget, which is not a healthy number for anybody. So those are kind of some of the highlights. You can see the numbers and peruse them as you will. The right side of this spreadsheet shows the budget that the finance team worked on, which would be for the period starting June 1st and going through the end of December. Now, there are assumptions in this budget. Steve shared that the building is not a certainty yet, so this budget was created with the thought that Wycliffe was going to be the location. So obviously, that number is not going to be a true number. The giving that's forecasted is basically, the assumption is $10,000 a week, which, as you can see when you compare the numbers, that's a much lower giving number than the previous 12 months that ended in March. but this is a budget that we felt was more reasonable based on where we thought the giving could be, where the building might be, and just looking at things overall, this is kind of where we felt that was a reasonable budget. So obviously things will change in the future, but this is kind of the target we had looked at. So if you do have any questions about this, I'm going to just ask Steve to come back up, and he'll kind of take your questions. So thanks for my time.
Appreciate it, man. Thank you for your help. So appreciative of the team that's worked so hard on these numbers for us to help, bring clarity and speak into the process. They are looking, just a few other things before I take questions. On a weekly basis, we are monitoring this and then making monthly decisions, so the team is actively engaged in the process and looking at that. They've also helped to, you'll begin to see weekly communication as well as to where the giving is at in a particular month and in the overall fiscal year. You will be seeing that on a weekly basis in these coming weeks in the celebration guide as well. So that'll be on top of the quarterly statement. Those numbers will be in. We just wanted to make sure that they were clear and accurate moving forward. So are there questions with where we're at financially or the budget that's been presented?
In regard to the paid staff that are currently paid, without going into specific details about your finances, have the paid staff been tasked with the burden of reducing their salaries and still doing more with less?
So as of right now, where the personnel is includes all the previous staff in there so that we have a buffer moving forward, and the current staff have not taken pay cuts at this point. We have 2 full-time, which is myself and Justin over here, and we have changed responsibilities. So everyone has increased, if not doubled responsibilities, but we have held the pay at the same. And then we also have 2 part-time, which is Anthony in worship, and then Marielle is our administrative assistant. And so those are the 2 part-time, 2 full-time. So right now, that's where we are.
Where's the buffer built into the budget for getting the 30-day reserve? Is it where it's built in here somewhere? I just can't see where it is.
So right now, the buffer, and please feel free to speak into this, is as we are currently and where giving is, we have the 67,000, which 10,000 a week is what we're anticipating for the budget. So on a 4-Sunday month, then we're anticipating $40,000 for that month. On a 5-Sunday month, then we're anticipating $50,000 for that month is how that's working. We have buffers built into the budget on a couple different places. We are currently then at that 30-day cash reserve, because at the max, that would be $50,000. We currently have $60,000 since we closed in March. And so we're at, by God's grace, that amount. Now, in any transition, there are transition expenses that have also been factored into this budget. So the one on the right, that does budget an additional $16,000 for transition expenses. And so that's part of where some of that shows up there as well to budget. That would include things like for children's ministry. There's ways of like how you set that up. That's going to be for new signage, depending on where the location is. That can be for speakers and sound equipment that would be necessary. And so that money is kind of budgeted in there to help with that. There's also a couple other areas that are buffered in there to ensure that we want it to move forward with the conservative budget, so that my hope and my desire is that we're not constantly trying to play catch up and saying, oh, let's meet this goal, we're behind, but saying this is where we're at now look at where God has led us. What opportunities exist? How can we use this? And that it's moving us forward. And so that there's it's conservative, moving forward, and then we're bold as we pray and ask how God is leading and the opportunities that we see in the community to then respond and have the means to respond as needs come. Like when I think about the immigration, the people that are coming from Puerto Rico following the hurricane and then the recent power outage, like if we weren't just saying, hey, where are we at? Like, oh, we're trying to play catch up, but hey, God's given us this amount. How can we engage and help meet this need in our community? That's where I want us to be as a church and as a congregation. That's a very different place than where we've been. And so this helps us get there. Does that help answer your question, Steve? So we are at the 30-day. It helps us maintain that through the end of the year. So this is kind of a transitional budget because it's through the end of 2018, and then when we're really looking to maintain and build that cash reserve, my desire would be then we're looking at a 60 and a 90-day as we begin to then think towards the future, towards a permanent location. We would need to continue to see that grow. We couldn't just stay there.
If there's in a typical budget, sometimes you go over budget. I mean, almost everybody does. There's no miscellaneous category in here. So if you go over budget on something, where will the excess come from? Would it come from that 30-day reserve? Like I'm saying, the next 6 months. Say you got some transition, expenses that you didn't count on, you weren't planning on. I don't see any room in here for if you go over. I'm sure you've thought of that, so I just wanted to ask you.
In the way that, sorry, I'm going to remove this because I kind of want to look at this, is that rather than it being in a separate field and just saying what that miscellaneous was, there's a couple areas where it exists. So one is we give 6% to CrossPointe Central, which we have left in there throughout the end of the year. But come September, we will no longer be paying that 6%. However, we realize that we're going to have increased expenses to replace the services that that's currently providing. And so we've left that 6% there, but knowing that we may not take all of that 6%, and so that there's a buffer built into these categories throughout to kind of account for what if we go over here, what don't we know. Same thing with personnel. There's a buffer there because our desire, we'd love to be able to have a part-time children's director. Like we want to be aware of, okay, where is God leading us for staff? What are our needs? What is our context? And so there's a buffer built in there as well. So these items, as they're listed, are not kind of to their max. So rather than them showing up separately as just a miscellaneous line, there's buffered throughout. Is that clear?
This isn't a budget question necessarily, but have we considered sharing a space with another church that already exists? When I lived in Minnesota, a church I was a part of, met after, I'm sure you guys have probably thought of it, but I just thought I'd throw it out there.
Yeah, the hard thing is that in this area, particularly in Lake Nona, this was the only building in Spring of Life. So I think it would be something.
So the idea of sharing with another school, that just isn't a possibility because of restrictions there.
Yeah, we have looked at that in other locations. I mean, I've looked at Seventh-day Adventists since I meet on Saturdays, and I'm like, hey, Sundays are open. Yes.
So I don't know if you guys already clarified this. What is the giving and support external versus internal?
Oh, that's a great question. So the difference is of the 10% that we currently give in our giving, 5% of that goes to CrossPointe congregations. So the plants that we have been supporting. So right now, that is Jupiter, Espanol. Is that it, Chris? Are we still supporting just those two? Yeah, so it's kind of a central fund that we're giving to, and then they would write a proposal, and then that they were helping to support to get that church plant started. And so 5% of our giving, and so that's, and it's designated differently. So that is the internal giving that goes toward, we give it out of our budget, but it goes into kind of a reserve for CrossPointe congregations. And then the external support is right now, like this includes Austin and Melissa Simpson, who are in France currently. And so it's going to support them as well. And so those are going to be outside missionaries and ministries that we support.
In the short term, has there been a thought of meeting somewhere where we may have the children in the service with us for a time?
I think my thought on that personally was thinking through that if we knew where it was leading to, so if we knew that it was, hey, this is going to be for 3 months, then this space is going to open up, it'll become available, and we'll make that transition, absolutely. I think the hard thing right now is it's just this indefinite, it's uncertain, and given where we're at as a church family, it felt like it had the potential to just lead to a slow fade, was kind of my concern. It wouldn't serve families well, and if we're just constantly looking in the impact, it didn't seem like it was setting us up to make a transition as a church body towards the future, which was really what those kind of initial questions were of like, how do we make this next transition that's going to set us up well beyond 6 months from now to a year to 5 years. And so that's why we resisted the idea, since there wasn't a known what we would be moving to. But if we knew that, I think it would be worthwhile to consider, because we're just kind of saying, okay, this is where we're going, but for this season, we can tough it out and do that. But that's why we didn't move forward with that idea.
It seems like a no children's ministry is better than no building at all. I mean, I grew up sitting with my parents in church, and I did just fine.
There are options and outside of Lake Nona, and so I think that's kind of, we're weighing, like, is being inside, obviously they're not city limits, but what everybody considers Lake Nona that important, or is it, something else?
Likely to happen quickly, or is the temporary option still an option?
That's really what we're praying for. I mean, again, we're praying for a solution by the end of April, that we have clarity as to, it may not be like definite and have everything worked out, but we do want to be able to provide clarity come in 2 weeks when we have the family update after the service on May 6th. I really believe that we need to have a clear idea of where we're at that point, so that we can, there's going to be a lot of work to be done. Whatever that is, there's a lot of work to be done. And so we need that clarity by then. So in the same way that in my mind and heart, when I was processing, okay, my visa expires on this date, I need God to kind of come through. This is what I'm praying. And this is what we need to see God move. Yes.
Just wondering, Steve, you'd mentioned at a family update, I don't know, a month ago, that Converge had plans for this facility. How immediate were their plans? My thinking is, if they don't have any immediate plans, meaning they don't have a tenant or a startup church that's going to move in June 1st, is there any possible for an extension at a reduced negotiated rate?
They are not willing to do an extension. Their plans are to launch in the fall. They did have a meeting today preparing for that launch. I don't know when that exact date is, but I do know when I've talked to Lee Stevenson, who will serve as the lead pastor, he has said that they'll be launching in the fall, and they will be here in this building. And so they wanted to be able to have space between when we were in the building, a time to go dark, and to not have anybody in the building before they launch the work that they're going to be doing. So there was not a desire or an opportunity to extend beyond the end of May because of how God's leading them forward for this new work in the fall. Yes.
Pastor Steve, I know that or I have the understanding, there's other CrossPointe churches here in Orlando. What have they done as far as consulting with us or us consulting with them? Any ideas as far as maybe, I don't know, reaching out as far as, I mean, I know we're seeking for space, but how are things looking between like looking at them or them looking at us?
Yeah, it's very good. I'm on a video conference call with them once a week, talking with them. We're interacting regularly. There's a desire to be, even though we'll be independent legal entities, there's still a desire to be a family of churches, relate and enjoy the fellowship of one another very well. So we've been talking together. We've been praying together throughout the situation, sharing thoughts and ideas. So it's been great. Now all of them are they're all in temporary facilities themselves. So they're either in a school or a YMCA for most of them. And so they kind of have ideas for that. But as far as ideas for Lake Nona specifically, other than what we've looked at, they don't know anything. I know Ryan called me last week and we talked through some options and he wanted to make some calls because he's the consummate networker and he's like, well, let me contact a few people I know. I'm like, let me know, like do your thing. So that's an ongoing process. But I would say we're in contact almost daily, but at least weekly.
There's on Narcoossee, there's a building that's coming up right in front of Pioneers. Anybody know what that is?
It's a hotel.
Okay.
A Holiday Inn.
Any expected time of completion?
August is the time of completion. I don't know that they're going to have space in there. I have talked.
No conference room?
Just because I love Pioneers. So I'm constantly
so you've already
talking with
gone
them.
there.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sarah?
Has anybody called the medical school?
Not that I know of. With these ideas, I would love, because I do want to remember them, if you could email me at steve@xpoint.com, any ideas or anything else that, like, if you're like, hey, what about this? Because I know, like, someone came up to me and was like, oh, what about, was it Innovation or something? Thrive Church is there. So a lot of them we have checked, and so that can be a quick response because I kind of have a spreadsheet of where we've checked and what's going on there. But when there's a new idea or something that we haven't considered, we can follow up with that. Or if you're willing to follow up and then let us know if it's worthwhile to make contact, that's even better.
My wife and I worked in children's ministry for a while, so I understand a little bit of the importance, logistics, but not maybe fully as parents with multiple kids and use the ministry full time. Do we rule out Wycliffe only because of that issue? And if that is the case, understanding where we are at now, with essentially 5 weeks, 6 weeks to go, lack of options, should Wycliffe maybe be rethought? I understand 20 weeks out of the year isn't ideal, but considering maybe
it's zero.
It's zero.
It's zero.
Oh, so it's been
so
taken.
So they have one large space, which is the volunteer center, which can seat about 250. And that would be the only space that we could use. And only on Sundays, there weren't other opportunities to use it beyond that. So there were some limitations to even that aspect. Basically what happened is as they were talking, and there's a lot of different entities within Wycliffe and Wycliffe Associates, and in the initial conversations that we had, it was just a lack of clarity. And so as we kind of got through the process and just gained more clarity, that's where it was like, oh, that's not because this training is actually happening there on these weeks and that wouldn't be available. And so as we moved through the process, what we thought was going to be available became significantly less out of necessity and respect for how they need to use their own facilities there.